The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet, sleepy town. A small breeze stirred the dry leaves, but the air held a strange stillness, as if the entire place was holding its breath. A small boy, no more than 9 years old, set off down the street with his backpack slung over one shoulder, the straps barely hanging on. It was the same routine as any other school day. He waved goodbye to his mother, the soft call of his name lingering in the air for a brief moment, a sound quickly swallowed by the morning. There was nothing unusual about that day, nothing that would suggest that it would be the last time anyone would see him. No one could have known then that within hours, the boy would vanish into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest traces, a boot print in the mud, a distant echo of his voice that no one could ever quite remember. What happened next is where the story truly begins, but not in the way one might expect. People will always talk about the details of a disappearance, the strange circumstances, the oddities that make the case stick in the mind like a splinter. But what people rarely understand is how the real story starts after the questions begin, when the search turns from hope to despair, when the searchers become the haunted. The father, who had kissed his son goodbye only hours before, could not have possibly imagined that his life would unravel in the way it did. He could not have known that the boy's disappearance would become a grotesque riddle that would twist the very fabric of his existence, a question with no answer, a wound that would never heal. He only knew, in the most basic of terms, that his son was gone, and he would stop at nothing to bring him back. At first, it was like any other missing child case. Local authorities scoured the area, checking nearby woods, asking neighbors, putting up flyers. The boy's name, his smiling face, became a familiar image in every store window and on every lamppost. The town rallied, like a small community does when tragedy strikes, but there was an undercurrent of disbelief that pulsed beneath the surface. How could a child simply vanish? How could he disappear without a trace in such a small town, in such an open space, with people everywhere? How could no one know what had happened? As the hours turned to days, the father's desperation deepened. He didn't trust the police. The town's law enforcement was ill-equipped to deal with a case like this. So he took matters into his own hands, turning every stone, searching every inch of the land around their home. He even ventured beyond the town's limits, convinced that if he followed his intuition, he might stumble upon some clue that would lead him to his son. It was not just the disappearance that gnawed at him. It was the silence that followed, the deafening, eerie silence. The absence of any clue, any lead, made the whole thing feel unnatural, like something sinister had woven itself in the fabric of the day. The hours dragged on in the same agonizing stretch. Each minute felt like an eternity, but still there was no sign. His son had vanished, and the world felt less real, as though the father himself was somehow becoming untethered from it. But the father didn't stop. He couldn't. Every time he thought about quitting, about going home, the thought of his son, somewhere out there all alone, would push him forward. His face, the image of him in his school clothes, the warmth of his hand in his father's. The memory was alive, pulsing like an aching heartbeat in the father's chest. The boy was alive. He had to be. Every corner of the town became a place of suspicion. The father began to ask questions. Who had seen his son last? Who had spoken to him? Had anyone noticed anything strange, anything different? But the answers were always vague, always tinged with hesitation. No one could offer anything concrete. Everyone seemed to be looking the other way, a strange reluctance hanging in the air like a fog. The town felt like a cage, a place where something terrible had happened, but no one was willing to admit it. The father's hope was beginning to twist into something darker, something more terrifying. What was everyone hiding? Was his son really lost? Or was there something else going on? What if the boy wasn't missing at all? What if he had been taken, stolen from them in the most unimaginable way? Then came the whispers. It started with one person, a neighbor, someone who had lived in the town for years, mentioning in passing that there had been rumors, strange occurrences in the past, talk of children going missing, of things being buried deep in the woods. The father dismissed it at first, chalking up to gossip, but the more people spoke in hushed tones, the more it became clear that something wasn't right. He began to dig deeper, asking around, pushing for answers. And that's when the cracks and facade of the town started to show. Old faces, those who had once seemed kind, friendly even, began to reveal their true nature. There were too many questions and too few answers. And the longer the father searched, the more the town seemed to close in around him. Days turned into weeks, and the town began to change. At first, there was a collective sense of sympathy, a shared grief for the boy's disappearance. But that quickly morphed into something else: resentment, suspicion. The father's constant searching began to irritate some people, and others started to distance themselves, as if the boy's disappearance was something too painful to revisit. It was as though the more the father searched for truth, the more the town tried to push him away. There were hushed conversations behind closed doors. People moved quickly to shut windows, to pull their curtains, as if the father might somehow uncover a secret they weren't ready to face. But the father didn't care. The whole town could turn its back on him. He didn't need anyone's help. He needed answers. His obsession with finding his son grew with each passing day, as if the search itself became a lifeline, something to hold on to in a world that was rapidly spinning out of control. He pushed on, searching places no one else would go. Abandoned buildings, distant fields, the nearby woods. He covered every inch of the land. It wasn't just for the boy anymore. It was for his own sanity. The weight of the town's secrecy was unbearable. The father wasn't the only one who was feeling the pressure. The townspeople began to sense the same dark, creeping fear that he felt. They knew something had happened to that boy, something more than just a simple disappearance. And each time they saw the father, each time they heard his voice crack with frustration, the town seemed to grow smaller, more suffocating. No one spoke up, but they all knew the boy's disappearance was not just a tragedy. It was a curse, something that had embedded itself into the very soul of the town, something that no one could escape, no matter how much they wished to. And then, one day, a clue appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. A toy, a small wooden car, chipped at the edges and covered in a light layer of dirt. It was abandoned in a patch of forest near the family's home, tucked away just out of sight. The father found it, and the moment his fingers touched the worn surface, he felt a strange shiver run through him. The toy was his son's, no doubt about it. But why was it here? The boy never played in these woods. The toy had been placed here, purposefully, intentionally. The father's heart raced as he turned it over in his hands, a cold sweat creeping down the back of his neck. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just some random discovery. It was a message, one that the boy had left for him. But what was it trying to say? The toy lay heavy in his palm, a symbol of something lost and forgotten. As the father stood there, the sounds of the town seemed distant, muffled, as if the entire world was being swallowed by the woods around him. The silence became suffocating, and the father's thoughts spiraled. This was no longer just a boy who had wandered off. This was a boy who had been taken, for reasons he could not yet understand. This was the beginning of something much darker, something that would change everything. The search continued, relentless and without mercy, as the father's grip on reality seemed to fray with every passing day. The initial days of hope had now shifted into a grim obsession, a need to unearth answers that felt as though they were slipping further from his grasp with every attempt. He had learned early on that the police couldn't be trusted to move quickly enough. Small towns rarely had the resources to handle something as complex as a missing child case, especially one that felt like it was laced with an undercurrent of something darker. No one could explain the boy's sudden disappearance, and a lack of concrete leads only made the whole situation feel more unreal, more like some nightmare from which he couldn't wake. He knew he had to find his son on his own. He had no choice. It wasn't just about finding a boy who had wandered off, or who had gotten lost somewhere in the woods. No, it was about piecing together a mystery that stretched beyond simple disappearance. There was something hidden here, something buried deep in the town's history, and the father, with nothing but his grief and determination to guide him, began to uncover it one small, seemingly insignificant piece at a time. Every corner of the town became a place of suspicion. Every encounter with the locals left him with more questions than answers. He watched their faces carefully when he asked if they'd seen anything unusual. The way their eyes darted away, the way their lips thinned. The town's facade, so neat and polished on the surface, seemed to crack a little more with each passing interaction. It was as though the very ground he walked on was starting to turn against him, pushing him deeper into the unknown, deeper into something he was not ready to confront. But the father didn't stop. He couldn't. Each lead, no matter how faint, no matter how small, felt like a sign that he was getting closer to the truth, and with it, closer to his son. The agony of not knowing was far worse than the pain of any revelation that might come. He knew that if he stopped searching, he might never find him. So he pressed on, day after day. He moved to the town like a ghost, unnoticed by most but filled with an insatiable hunger for answers. He knocked on doors, stopped strangers in the street, and even scoured the woods surrounding the town with persistence that was borderline madness. He was a man possessed, consumed by the need to find his boy, and the feeling that the town itself was somehow complicit in hiding the truth. The longer he searched, the more desperate his questions became. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. People spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, offering only vague words of sympathy that held no weight. The local sheriff seemed to be getting more and more impatient with his inquiries, offering the same tired assurances, that they were doing everything they could, that the boy would turn up soon, that this was just a phase. But the father knew, deep down, that this wasn't a phase. Something had happened to his son, something terrible, and if he didn't find the answers soon, he feared he might lose more than just his child. He feared that he might lose himself, too. With each passing week, the father's fixation grew. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and hollow. His wife, though clearly suffering, had already begun to retreat into her own form of silent suffering. She stopped asking questions. She stopped searching. She held on to a thin thread of hope, but it was fraying fast. She began to speak in soft, resigned tones, saying things like, "Maybe we should let it go, let them do their job, and hope he comes home." But the father couldn't let go. Not yet. Not when there was still the faintest glimmer of hope. There was still so much that didn't make sense, so many unanswered questions. And then came the whispers, first faint, barely audible, but gradually growing louder. The townspeople, whom the father had trusted, were now casting him suspicious glances. No longer did they greet him with the usual smiles and pleasantries. Instead, they hurried past him, eyes fixed on the ground. The whispers would stop whenever he came close. People would glance nervously over their shoulders, muttering something to each other, only to go quiet the moment they noticed the father's eyes. He was beginning to feel like an outsider in the very place he had once called home, the town he had lived in for all these years, the town where he had raised his family, seemed to be turning on him. The more questions he asked, the more uncomfortable it seemed to make people. What were they hiding? Why did they seem so afraid of the truth? In his mind, there was only one explanation. The people here knew something they weren't willing to share, something that went beyond just a missing child. There was an unease in the air, a sense that something larger was at play. The father couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he was getting closer to something important. The very atmosphere of the town seemed to shift. The once familiar streets felt alien. The comforting sound of the town, the creak of the old wooden shops, the distant hum of conversations at the local diner, had been replaced by an eerie silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. With the days dragging on and the mystery continuing to deepen, the father's resolve hardened. The idea that the town had something to do with his son's disappearance, whether through ignorance, indifference, or something darker, planted a seed of suspicion in his heart. He began to visit the places no one else dared go. Abandoned buildings, empty fields, forgotten alleyways. If his son had wandered off, then he might have ended up in one of these places. If the boy had been taken, these places might hold the answers. And so, with the fervor of a man who has nothing left to lose, the father spent his days combing to the edges of town, determined to find something, anything, that might bring him closer to the truth. He became obsessed with the idea that there was a hidden history in this town, a secret past that no one wanted to acknowledge. He heard murmurs of strange occurrences, missing children from decades before, whispers of people who had vanished without a trace, their names lost to time. It was almost as if the town had a collective memory, a dark undercurrent that no one spoke of, but everyone knew existed. Was this something the townspeople had buried? Had they forgotten? or were they actively hiding the truth? One evening, after another long day of searching, the father found himself standing near the edge of the woods that bordered the town. The trees loomed dark and heavy, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Something about this place had always unsettled him, even before his son's disappearance. There was a heaviness to it, an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow sound. But today, as he stood there, something felt different. The air was thick, charged with unspoken tension. He thought he saw a figure moving in the distance, a fleeting shadow, a silhouette too quick to identify. His heart raced as he stepped closer, hoping against hope that it might be his son, that somehow, impossibly, the boy had wandered back. But the shadow disappeared into the trees, leaving the father standing alone, with only the sound of his own breathing for company. He had come here, hoping for a breakthrough, but instead, he was left with more questions. He began to feel the weight of his isolation, the fact that he was alone in this, that no one else seemed to understand. His wife had stopped asking where he was going, stopped inquiring if he had found anything. The other townspeople had long since withdrawn, and the sheriff's calls had become more distant, more perfunctory. The father, once a man of optimism, was now consumed by the certainty that the truth was somewhere hidden beneath the surface. The harder he searched, the more he felt that it was slipping through his fingers. But there was no turning back now. He had passed the point of no return. He couldn't stop searching for the boy. And even though the father felt as though he was losing his grip on everything, his sanity, his family, the very reality of the town around him, he couldn't stop. Because if he did, what would that mean? Would it mean that his son was truly gone? That the town had already forgotten? That the truth would remain buried forever? And so he pressed on, each day growing more weary, more worn, but unable to stop. The boy was out there, somewhere, and the father would find him, even if it cost him everything. The town, once so familiar, began to feel like a strange, alien place, a place where the rules had changed and the people, once so kind, now felt distant, unreadable. The father, consumed by his grief and desperate to find answers, began to notice things he hadn't before. He could feel the weight of the town's secrets pressing in on him, the unspoken tension that hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating every breath he took. The townspeople seemed to avoid his gaze, eyes averted, lips pressed tight as if some invisible force was pushing them away. Conversation stilled when he entered a room. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders as though they feared he might overhear something he wasn't meant to. It was subtle at first, a fleeting look, a dropped word, a brief silence, but soon it became undeniable. The town was hiding something, and the more the father searched, the more it seemed that they were actively trying to keep him from uncovering the truth. The father's frustration deepened. He wasn't just looking for his son anymore. He was looking for the truth about this town, about the people he had lived among for so many years. What had they known? What had they kept hidden? His suspicion began to bleed into paranoia. Everyone was a potential suspect in his mind, even those who had once been his friends, his neighbors. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. There were too many gaps, too many things that didn't add up. The longer he stayed, the more it felt like the town itself was turning against him, like some unspoken force was conspiring to keep him from seeing the truth. In his mind, the pieces began to fall into place, though he couldn't yet grasp what the bigger picture looked like. There were too many loose ends, too many scattered clues that didn't make sense. His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone taken his son? Was it one of the townspeople? Someone who had lived here for years? Someone the father had once known and trusted? Or was it something darker, something older? Something that went back generations? Something buried beneath the surface of the town like a long-forgotten wound that had never truly healed? The father began to delve deeper into the history of the town, though it wasn't something he had ever thought to do before. He'd lived here for most of his life, after all, and the town had always seemed like a safe place, a place where everyone knew each other, where the past was just a distant memory. But now, with the disappearance of his son, he saw the town in a new light. There were rumors, whispers that circulated just beneath the surface, stories of things that had happened long ago, things that no one talked about openly, strange disappearances, things that had been swept under the rug. And every time the father dug into the past, he found more and more things that didn't fit. He began asking questions. At first, it was subtle, just a comment here, a word there, trying to gauge people's reactions. But with each passing day, his questions grew bolder, more direct. He asked the sheriff. He asked the older residents. He even asked the people who ran the local diner. But every time, he was met with the same resistance, the same quiet evasion. No one would tell him anything. And when they did speak, their words were vague, rehearsed. It was as if they had all agreed, silently, not to acknowledge the things that had been hidden. Some of them gave him sympathetic smiles. Others avoided him completely. But none of them gave him the answers he was looking for. They all knew something, and they were all willing to keep it from him. The father's anger grew. How dare they keep secrets from him? How dare they pretend that nothing was wrong when his son was missing? Every door he knocked on, every person he questioned, led him to a dead end. It felt like the town was a labyrinth, its walls closing in around him with each new discovery, each new whisper. He had once been a part of this place, had once trusted the people here. But now, he was an outsider, a stranger in his own home. He couldn't trust anyone anymore, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how alone he really was. The isolation began to gnaw at him. There was a deep, aching loneliness that settled into his bones. It wasn't just the absence of his son. It was the absence of the life he had once known. His wife, too, had begun to retreat into herself, her sorrow consuming her in ways he couldn't reach. She stopped speaking of their son. She stopped asking if he had found anything. She began to live in a quiet, resigned state of mourning, as if she had already accepted the worst, as if she had already begun to let go. But the father couldn't let go. He couldn't. He refused to. He would not accept that his son was gone forever, not without a fight. It wasn't just a missing child that haunted him anymore. It was the town itself. The father had come to the unsettling realization that there was something fundamentally wrong with this place. He felt like an intruder, walking among ghosts who refused to acknowledge him. The very fabric of the town seemed to hold a secret, a dark undercurrent that pulsed beneath the surface. And as he dug deeper, he began to feel the weight of that secret bearing down on him. It was as if the town was built on a foundation of lies, a history that no one wanted to confront. The more he uncovered, the more the townspeople recoiled, as if afraid of what might be brought to light. They were terrified of the truth. The father couldn't stop. The need to uncover the truth was like a fire that burned within him, a fire that couldn't be quenched. And so, he began to visit places he had never been before, places that had been long forgotten, abandoned by the rest of the town. The old mill on the outskirts of town, the church graveyard, the deep woods that stretched beyond the edge of the town, places that were no longer part of the everyday life of the town, but had once been central to its history. It was in these forgotten spaces that the father began to sense the presence of something darker, something older. The air was thick with it, as if the very ground had absorbed the pain and sorrow of generations past. One day, while wandering through the woods, the father stumbled upon a dilapidated shack. It had been abandoned for years, the walls rotting with age, the roof caved in. But something about it called to him, a strange pull that he couldn't resist. He pushed through the overgrown brush, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped inside. The air inside the shack was thick with dust and mildew, the floor creaking under his weight. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been here recently. As he moved further into the dark interior, he spotted something in the corner of the room, a faded piece of cloth, tattered and torn, lying half hidden beneath the debris. His breath caught in his throat. It was his son's favorite jacket. His fingers trembled as he knelt to pick it up, his mind racing. How had it gotten here? What did this mean? His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of discovery sinking in. The jacket was a sign, a clue. But what did it lead to? And why had it been left here, hidden away in this forsaken shack? The father's mind raced with possibilities. Had his son been here? Had he been brought here by someone? And why would anyone want to leave a jacket behind? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the father stood frozen in the dim light, surrounded by the haunting remnants of a past he had never known. The discovery of the jacket, so close to his son's disappearance, was just a beginning. There was more to uncover, and with every step, the father was getting closer to the truth. even if it meant uncovering a darkness he was not prepared to face. The discovery of his son's jacket in the abandoned shack shook the father to his core. For a moment, the ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, as if the very reality he had clung to had begun to unravel. His heart raced, the weight of the jacket in his hands feeling impossibly heavy. The small, familiar fabric, so out of place here in this forgotten ruin, became a symbol of everything he had lost and everything he was about to find. He couldn't shake the feeling that this jacket, this seemingly insignificant object, was a key to understanding what had happened to his son, to understanding the darkness that had taken root in this town. The question of how the jacket had ended up in the shack gnawed at him. His son had never been here, at least not that he knew of. He couldn't recall a single moment when the boy had shown any interest in this place, let alone walked out into these woods to leave his jacket behind. The logical explanation was that the boy had been brought here, that someone from the town, had taken him to this spot, hidden away in the woods, and left behind the only trace of him the father had found in weeks. But why? Why would anyone go to such lengths to hide his son's jacket, to leave it in such a remote and forgotten place? The father's hands shook as he gripped the fabric tighter, his mind whirling with the possibilities. He could hear his son's voice, soft and innocent, calling out to him from the depths of his memory. But that voice was growing quieter with every passing day. It was fading, like an echo that was slowly being swallowed by the distance. The more time passed, the more impossible it felt to believe that the boy would ever return. And yet, this jacket, this clue, was like a lifeline, a thread he could follow, pulling him further into the heart of the mystery that had consumed his life. He stood there in the shack for what felt like an eternity, the silence around him oppressive. The world seemed to narrow, as if the walls of the shack were closing in, making everything feel small and insignificant. The father was trapped, caught between the past he had known and the unrelenting pull of truth that was slowly coming to light. He couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he knew what had happened. Not until he understood why his son was gone. He made his way back to the town, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of questions, each one more urgent than the last. The closer he got to the center of town, the more the feeling of unease grew. The townspeople went about their business, their eyes never meeting his, their faces blank with a quiet wariness. It was as though they were waiting for something, waiting for him to uncover the truth, or perhaps waiting for him to disappear, just like his son had. The thought made his stomach churn. He couldn't help but feel that the town was watching him, as though his every move was being scrutinized, evaluated. And yet, no one would speak to him. No one would answer his questions. It was as if they all knew something he didn't, and were content to let him stumble around in the dark. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in town anymore. The people he had known all his life, the people he had once considered his friends, were now nothing more than strangers, their faces unreadable, their intentions unknowable. He felt the walls of the town closing in around him, its secrets pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The more he searched, the more it became clear that the town itself had become an enigma, a place where the past and the present collided, where the truth was buried so deep that no one dared to look for it. But he had to look. He had no choice. His son was out there, somewhere, and he would not stop until he found him. The search led him to a new set of questions, more pressing and far more dangerous than anything he'd uncovered before. Who had known about the boy's disappearance? Who had seen something they weren't willing to share? There were rumors, whispers that bubbled up from the depth of the town, half-formed stories that no one wanted to acknowledge. Some said that strange things had happened in the town before, things that people had tried to forget, to bury. Other children, other disappearances that were never fully explained. The father couldn't ignore the growing sense that his son's disappearance was not the first, and that it wouldn't be the last. He began to hear stories of children who had vanished in the past, their names swallowed up by the town's history, their disappearances never fully resolved. It was as though the town itself had developed an amnesia about its own dark past, sweeping these events under the rug and moving on as if nothing had happened. But the father wasn't willing to forget. He couldn't. As he dug deeper into the town's history, he began to uncover unsettling patterns, connections that led him back to the very place where his son had disappeared. The more he uncovered, the more the town's dark history began to unravel. There were records of children vanishing, Stories that seemed to mirror his own. Some had been found, some never had been, but they all seemed to follow the same disturbing pattern. Children taken, children lost, children whose disappearances were never truly explained. The town had always moved on, never looking back, never questioning what had really happened. And the father began to wonder, had his son been the latest in a long line of victims? There was one name, in particular, that kept resurfacing in the records, someone from the town's distant past, a figure who'd been involved in several of the earlier disappearances. The name was always mentioned in hushed tones, never spoken aloud. There were no official records to explain who this person was or what their involvement had been, but the father couldn't ignore the fact that their name kept popping up. The more he researched, the more it seemed as though this person had played a significant role in the strange disappearances that had plagued the town for decades. But why? What connection did this person have to the events that had unfolded in the town? And how was it connected to his son's disappearance? The father's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. The town had hidden its secrets for years, but now, with each new discovery, the truth was beginning to surface. And with it came an overwhelming realization. The town had been complicit in these disappearances. It wasn't just the individual actions of a few people. It was something deeper, something systemic. The town itself had turned a blind eye to the darkness that lived among them, choosing to forget the past rather than confront it. The father felt sick to his stomach. He had spent his entire life here, raising his family in a town that, in hindsight, seemed to be built on lies. And now, with his son's disappearance, the mask had finally slipped, revealing a truth that was far more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The urgency to find his son intensified. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't allow his son to become another forgotten victim of the town's past. There was still so much he didn't know, so many questions left unanswered, but one thing was certain. His son was caught in the web of this town's darkness, and he would stop at nothing to unravel it. He would face the town, face the people who had turned their backs on him, and force them to confront the truth. He would tear down the walls of silence, and if it meant exposing everything, the lies, the secrets, the guilt, then so be it. He clutched the jacket tightly, as if it were the last thing connecting him to his son, the last tangible piece of the life he had lost. His resolve hardened. The town had no idea what was coming, and neither did he. But one thing was clear. The truth would come out no matter the cost. And when it did, it would shatter everything. The deeper the father plunged into the secrets of the town, the more the walls around him seemed to grow thicker, as if the very fabric of his life had been sealed off from the truth. Every discovery, every answer he uncovered, seemed to raise more questions than it solved, leaving him with a sense of unease that tightened around his chest like an unrelenting grip. The jacket he had found in the abandoned shack, so out of place yet so undeniably connected to his son, had unlocked a door into the town's hidden past, one that he could never have imagined in his worst nightmares. With every step he took closer to the truth, the father realized that the town was not just a place of forgotten memories and lost histories. It was a place haunted by a darkness that had been carefully buried and ignored for far too long. The weight of his findings pressed down on him, and the once familiar streets of the town now felt like a maze he couldn't escape. The very essence of the town seemed to have shifted beneath his feet. The once vibrant, bustling places he had known all his life now stood silent, as if waiting for something to break. The memories of his son, the joy of watching him grow, of hearing his laughter echo through their home, began to feel like distant echoes. How long had it been since the boy disappeared? How long had the world moved on while he stood still, frozen in time? The questions tormented him, gnawing away at his resolve. The pain of losing his son was immense, but was the unbearable weight of knowing that no one in the town had truly cared, that no one had even tried to look for the truth, that made the father's heart burn with fury. The more he dug, the more it became clear. This town had been living in the shadow of its past, quietly ignoring its darkest secrets, allowing the horror to continue without ever confronting it. As he uncovered the town's history, the father's mind began to unravel. The patterns were too strong, too eerie to ignore. The disappearances were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a far larger story, one that had spanned generations. Every decade seemed to bring a new child gone missing, a new life that was snatched away without explanation. Some had been found, some never had been, but each disappearance was met with the same blank stares and vague reassurances from the townspeople. The police, too, had always been quick to close the case. It was as though they weren't on it, or worse, too afraid to look any deeper into the dark currents that ran beneath the surface of their idyllic town. The father's search led him into forgotten corners of the town, where the ghosts of its past seemed to linger, caught between the present and something far darker. He visited the old buildings, the ones that no longer served a purpose, the ones that had been abandoned in the wake of time. In the local library's dusty archives, he found records that spoke of a long-forgotten figure, someone whose name had been lost in the annals of history. This figure, he soon learned, was tied to the earliest disappearances in the town, someone whose shadow still loomed large, even though no one ever dared speak of them. The more the father learned, the more a chilling realization began to settle over him. The townspeople weren't just complicit in hiding the truth. They were active participants in a cycle of horror that had been passed down generation after generation, with no one daring to break it. The father's determination only grew stronger. He couldn't stop now, not after everything he had uncovered, not when the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. But there were moments, quiet moments, when the weight of what he was uncovering threatened to crush him. The town he had grown up in, the town he had once loved, had been built on secrets and lies. It had nurtured its own brand of darkness, and the longer he searched, the more the town felt like a trap, one that had slowly and deliberately closed in on him. The fear that had started as a whisper was now a constant, suffocating presence. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople upon him, following his every move, as though they all knew something he didn't, something he wasn't ready to face. Every step forward was met with resistance, as if the very soil of the town was pushing back against him, trying to keep him from uncovering the truth. The more the father pieced together the fragmented history of the town, the more the truth seemed to evade him, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had found hints, traces of something dark that had been buried for too long, but nothing solid enough to explain what had really happened to his son. And yet, in the quiet corners of his mind, he began to suspect that there was more to the story than mere disappearances. These weren't just innocent children lost to the wilderness or to bad luck. No, there was something far more insidious at play. It wasn't until he spoke to an elderly woman in the town, someone who had lived through the earliest days of the disappearances, that the full weight of the town's buried secrets began to come into focus. She had been reluctant to speak at first, her hands trembling as she avoided the father's gaze. But when he mentioned the name of the mysterious figure, the one whose shadow had seemed to cast itself over every disappearance, her eyes grew wide, and for the first time, she seemed to understand what he was searching for. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words she spoke sent a chill through his spine. It was never about the children, she said. It was never about them being lost. They were taken, yes, but for a reason. They were offered. The word hung in the air like a prayer, spoken but not fully understood. The father's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. Offered? He asked, barely able to form the words. Offered to whom? The woman's eyes darted around the room, her voice trembling. There's a pact, a price we've all paid. We don't talk about it, don't even remember, but the price is paid every time. The town feeds it, feeds whatever it is that takes the children. We all just turn a blind eye, hope it doesn't happen again. But it always does. And now it's your son. Her voice broke, and she sank back in her chair, as though the weight of what she had just revealed had exhausted her. The father stood frozen, unable to process what she had said, his heart thudding in his chest. An offering? A price? The idea was incomprehensible, but there was a truth in her words, something that rang too loudly in his ears to ignore. The disappearances were not random. They were not the work of one sick individual or even a group of people. They were part of something much larger, something so deeply embedded in the town's history that no one had the courage to speak of it. It was as if the town itself had made a deal, a dark pact that had been passed down through generations, a pact that demanded a price be paid for the town's survival, for its prosperity, its peace. The father's mind spun wildly as he pieced this together. His son, his beloved boy, had become part of this horrifying ritual, just like the children who had vanished before him. It was the only explanation that made sense, and it sent a cold wave of dread through his body. But what could he do? The town was bound to this pact, its people complicit in the horror that had played out time and time again. The idea of breaking the cycle seemed impossible. The town was entrenched in its own twisted traditions, and no matter how much the father searched, no matter how much he uncovered, there would always be more darkness to uncover. Still, he couldn't give up. The truth had to be revealed. His son had to be found, no matter the cost. But as the weight of what he had learned settled on him, the father realized just how alone he was. The town had turned its back on him, and now he was on the verge of uncovering a secret so monstrous that it could destroy everything. The walls were closing in, and every moment felt like it was pulling him further into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. In the depths of his desperation, the father understood the magnitude of the choice before him. To find his son, he would have to expose the town's darkest truth, a truth that, if brought into the light, would tear apart everything he had ever known. Could he bear it? Could he destroy the very foundation of the place he had once called home? The weight of the decision was unbearable. But the alternative, letting his son's disappearance become another forgotten tragedy, a casualty of the town's cruel pact, was something he could never accept. No matter what it took, no matter the cost, he would see this through. The town's secret would be revealed and his son would be found, even if it meant facing the unimaginable horror that had been concealed for so long. The father's mind was swirling with the weight of everything he had uncovered. The shocking revelations, the eerie whispers, the chilling truth of the town's pact. It was all too much for any one person to comprehend. But there was no turning back now. The horror had rooted itself so deeply into his life, into the very fabric of the town, that to stop searching, to let it go, would be a betrayal of everything he had fought for. His son was still out there, somewhere, and he would not rest until he found him, even if the truth he was about to uncover would unravel the very world he had known. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. "Your son is part of it now," she had whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. The idea that his son, the boy he had raised, had been taken to fulfill some dark and ancient ritual was incomprehensible. But the more he thought about it, the more it began to make sense. The disappearances had always been part of the town's history, a cycle that repeated itself with eerie regularity. The children were chosen not by chance, but by some unfathomable force that had bound the town to its will. They were taken, offered up, and the town, in exchange, was allowed to continue its existence, its peace, its prosperity. But at what cost? What kind of monster could ask for such a price? And what kind of town could willingly offer up its children to pay it? The answers were just out of reach, like a dark shadow lingering just beyond his grasp. Every corner he turned, every question he asked, led him deeper into a labyrinth of silence and fear. The townspeople had made their peace with this arrangement long ago, it seemed, but the father had not. He would never make peace with it, not when his son was involved. He would tear down the walls of secrecy, expose the truth for all to see, no matter what the consequences. He started with the town's oldest records, scouring through crumbling documents in the local archives. What he found only confirmed his darkest suspicions. The disappearances were not random. They were not the work of a lone predator or some freak accident. They were part of a larger, more terrifying pattern, one that had been carefully orchestrated over generations. Each decade, a child was chosen, taken from their home, their family, and their fate sealed by the town's ancient pact. The records were sparse, fragmented, but there were enough whispers in the pages to show a disturbing pattern. The children were never found, at least not truly. Some returned, but they were never the same. Others vanished without a trace, their names fading into the past, their stories erased from history. The more the father uncovered, the more he began to understand the true scope of the horror that had plagued this town. The town had been built on lies, on the blood of the innocent. Every generation had paid the price for its survival, and each child taken was a reminder of the dark pact that bound them all. The people in the town, his neighbors, his friends, had all turned a blind eye to the horror that lived among them. They had accepted it, justified it, as if it was the only way for them to continue living their comfortable lives. To them, it was simply the way things were, but for the father, it was something he could never accept. It wasn't right. It was monstrous. His son, his flesh and blood, had become part of this twisted ritual, and he wouldn't let it stand. There were still more questions left unanswered, and the deeper the father dug, the more terrified he became of what he might find. Who was the force that demanded these children? What was the true nature of the pact? Why had the town agreed to such a thing? And what would happen if the pact was broken? The more he uncovered, the more the father began to realize that the answers weren't just buried in the town's past. They were hidden in plain sight. The people who had lived here, the ones who had made this dark agreement, were still around. They were the ones who knew the truth, the ones who had kept it hidden all these years. They were the ones who would protect the secret at all costs. The father knew he had to confront them. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep searching blindly, hoping that the answers would come to him. No, he needed to face the people who had bound his town to this horror, the ones who had knowingly sacrificed their children for the sake of peace. He needed to demand the truth. But as he prepared for confrontation, the weight of the task before him became overwhelming. The truth he was about to face wasn't just about his son. It was about everything, the town, its history, its people. To expose the truth would mean destroying the very foundation of the place he had once called home. It would mean unraveling the fabric of their lives, revealing the darkness that had been festering for so long. The father's heart pounded in his chest as he walked through the town streets, the faces of its residents blurring as he passed. He had lived here for so long, and yet, now, it felt like a foreign land, a place where the rules no longer made sense. The warm smiles he had once received from the townspeople were now replaced by cold stares, eyes that followed him wherever he went. He was no longer one of them. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. His destination was clear. The old church stood at the edge of town, its spire piercing the sky like a silent sentinel, watching over the town's dark history. The church had been here long before he was born, and it had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations. It was here he had learned that the pact had been forged, the place where the town's darkest secrets were kept hidden beneath layers of stone and prayer. He had no illusions about what he would find inside. The church, with its cold stone walls and its empty, echoing halls, had been the center of the town's darkest rituals for as long as anyone could remember. And now, it was the place where the father would confront the people who held the answers to his son's disappearance. The door to the church creaked as he pushed it open, and the chill of the air hit him immediately, the smell of old wood and incense thick in the silence. The father stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the worn floorboards beneath him. The church was empty, save for the few remaining members of the town's council, elderly figures, their faces weathered by years of secrecy, by years of watching the town continue its grim cycle. They were waiting for him. They had known he would come eventually. They had always known. At the far end of the church, the altar stood shrouded in shadow, its presence imposing. The father walked toward it, each step heavy with the knowledge of what he was about to do. He could feel the eyes of the council on him, their gaze cold and calculating, as if they were watching the last remnants of his hopes slip away. He stopped in front of the altar, his heart pounding as he faced the people who had turned his world upside down. "I know what you've been hiding," the father said, his voice steady but filled with quiet rage. "I know what this town has done. I know what you've done, and I'm not leaving until you tell me everything." The silence that followed was thick, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The council didn't move, didn't speak. But the father saw something flicker in their eyes, something ancient, something that had been buried so deep that it had become part of their very being. The truth was here in front of him, but it would not come easily. It never did. They had kept their secret for so long, and now, finally, the walls were coming down. It was time for the truth to be revealed, no matter the cost. "We've done what we had to do," one of the council members said, her voice low and weary. "We made the pact so many years ago to save the town. The children were always the price. We didn't ask for this. We didn't choose it. But it was the only way." The father's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, the price? What is it? What is taking them?" But the council would not answer. Their silence spoke volumes, more than words ever could. The weight of their knowledge, of their complicity, was a burden that none of them could bear to lift. The father's heart shattered, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had uncovered. His son had been part of this. His boy, taken as part of the town's sick ritual, offered up as a price for the peace the town had enjoyed for so long. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the truth, no matter how horrifying it was. The father turned away from the altar, his soul heavy with the weight of everything he had learned. The truth had come at a terrible cost, and yet it had to be known. There was no turning back now. The town's darkest secret had been laid bare, and the father knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The father's world had crumbled, piece by piece, and yet the truth that it uncovered felt like an anchor. His heart was shattered by the horrors of what he had learned, but there was no turning back. No longer could he cling to the comforting illusion that the town he had known and loved was simply a quiet place where nothing ever truly went wrong. The walls that had surrounded him, the lies that had been whispered behind closed doors, the stories that had been buried under layers of time, all of it was now laid bare. And with the truth came the crushing weight of responsibility. The town's secret had been exposed, but the revelation was only the beginning. The moment the father learned of the pact, a deal forged in darkness and sustained by generations of silence, he understood that the past was not just something that could be forgotten. The children, taken year after year to satisfy some unknown force, had been the price of the town's survival, for its prosperity. The people, including the father himself, had lived under the shadow of this unspoken truth, and as he stood at the threshold of the church, confronting the silent, unyielding faces of the town's elders, it became clear that the truth was not only a revelation, it was a curse. The council had explained their role in this twisted ritual, their participation in the dark agreement that bound them all. But the father could not accept their justifications. They spoke of survival, of protection, of a peace that came at a cost. But the cost was too great. The lives of innocent children, including his own, had been traded for a peace that could only be bought with blood. The weight of their words pressed down on him, but there was no room for compassion, no room for understanding. What the council had done was unforgivable. They had chosen this path, and now the consequences were too horrific to ignore. The father left the church with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth. The air outside felt thick with the town's secrets, the oppressive weight of the past clinging to every building, every street, every face. It was a place he had known his whole life. Yet now, it felt like a foreign land. The once familiar streets now seemed unfamiliar, tainted by the truth that had been hidden for so long. The faces of the townspeople, the people he had once called his neighbors, now seemed colder, more distant. The father could feel their eyes on him as he walked past, their gaze a silent condemnation. They were part of it all, complicit in the darkness that had held the town in its grip for so long. But none of them would speak of it. None of them would break the silence. The town was bound by fear, by an unspoken pact that had woven itself into the very fabric of their existence. He couldn't understand how they had allowed it to happen. How had they all turned a blind eye to the suffering of the children? How had they convinced themselves that this was the price of peace, the price of survival? He had always believed that the town was a safe place, a place where families were protected, where children could grow up without fear. But now he saw it for what it truly was, a place that had been built on darkness, on a lie that had been passed down through generations, a lie that had taken the lives of so many innocent children. The more the father thought about it, the more he realized that the town itself was a living entity, sustained by the pact that had been made so long ago. The people who lived here were not just victims. They were part of the cycle. They had accepted the pact, had lived with it for so long that they could no longer see the horror it had wrought. They had forgotten what it meant to live without the shadow of the pact hanging over them. They had become numb to the suffering, desensitized to the pain of the children who were taken year after year. And now, it was his son who had been chosen. It was his son who had become part of the cycle, a price to be paid for the town's peace. The father couldn't stand the thought of it. He couldn't bear the idea that his son had been taken, offered as a sacrifice to an unknown force, to a pact that the town had made with something far darker than they could ever understand. And yet it had happened. His son was gone, lost to the darkness, and there was nothing he could do to bring him back. The weight of that realization felt like a punch to the gut. The grief, the anger, the pain, it all crashed down on him in a wave that threatened to swallow him whole. But even in the midst of his despair, there was something else stirring within him. A fire, a determination to fight back, to break the cycle, to destroy the pact that had held the town in its grip for so long. The father's mind raced as he walked the streets of town, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to act. He couldn't allow this to continue. He couldn't let his son become just another name in a long list of children who had disappeared, who had been sacrificed to the town's twisted ritual. He didn't know how. He didn't know what it would take, but he knew one thing. The pact had to be broken. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to do something about it. The question was how. How could he possibly break a pact that had existed for so long, a pact that had been so deeply ingrained in the town's very existence? The people in the town were bound by this unspoken agreement, by the fear that had kept them silent for so many years. The father had no illusions about what would happen if he tried to expose the truth. The town would turn against him. They would protect their secret at all costs, and in doing so, they would protect the pact. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't let the fear of what might happen prevent him from fighting for his son. He knew the town would never accept the truth willingly. The pact had become part of their very identity. To tear it apart, to expose the darkness that had been buried for so long, would mean tearing apart the very foundation of everything they had known. It would mean destroying their peace, their survival, their way of life. And they would not allow that. The father understood this now. The town had lived in fear for so long, had accepted the pact as a necessary evil, that they would do anything to protect it, even if it meant sacrificing their own children. But the father had nothing left to lose. His son was gone. The truth was out. There was no going back to the life he had once known. He had crossed a line, and now there was no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter where it led. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. He couldn't let the town continue its dark cycle. He had to fight. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the father felt something rise up within him. A fierce, unyielding determination. He would not let the town continue. He would not let the pact stand. The darkness that had festered for so long could not be allowed to grow any longer. He had to expose it, to break it, to destroy it. The father didn't know how he would do it, but he knew it had to be done. There were no more questions, no more doubts. His son had been taken, but he would not let him be forgotten. He would not let the cycle continue. And so, with a heart full of fury and a mind set on the truth, the father took the first step toward destroying the town's dark pact. The battle ahead would be long, and it would be brutal, but the father was no longer afraid. He had nothing left to fear. His son was lost, but the father's love, his will to fight, was stronger than any fear the town could impose. He would find a way to break the pact. He would bring an end to the darkness that had haunted this town for generations. And no matter the cost, he would not stop until he had done so. The father's resolve burned with an intensity that could not be extinguished, no matter the weight of the horror that pressed upon him. Each step forward was a defiant act, a refusal to be swallowed by the abyss of secrets that had consumed his life. He had learned the truth, an unspeakable truth that twisted everything he had once believed. And now it was his burden to carry, his responsibility to ensure that it would not be buried again. The town's pact, its insidious bargain, had been built on lies. But in the face of everything he had learned, he realized that the lies could no longer hold the town together. They would crumble, and the truth, no matter how terrifying, would be exposed. The first question that haunted him was how to confront those who had allowed this horror to continue, how to confront the very system that had sustained the pact for generations. The town was its people, their fears, their choices, and though many of them had long ago buried the truth under the weight of their own denial, they were all complicit. They had all known, at least in the shadows of their minds, that the price of peace was a child taken, and yet they had remained silent. The father understood now that the silence was not just a collective act of forgetting, but of survival. They had convinced themselves that the horror was necessary, that the cost was worth the price. But he could not live with that, could not accept that his son had become just another offering to some unseen force that had claimed too many lives before. He couldn't allow them to hide behind their silence anymore. The truth had been buried for so long, and now it was up to him to bring it to the surface. There would be no more waiting, no more pretending. There would be no more quiet resignation to the cycle. If the town would not confront its darkness, then he would drag it into the light. He would expose everything. The town's complicity, the generations of children who had been taken, and the very nature of the pact itself. It would be terrifying. It would shatter lives. But it had to be done. The father spent days in isolation, his thoughts swirling as he tried to form a plan. He knew he couldn't do it alone. The council, the town leaders, the ones who had upheld the pact, would never willingly reveal the truth. They would never open the doors to the darkness they had so carefully locked away. But he had seen something in the town's archives, something buried in the records that hinted at a way to break the cycle. It wasn't just about exposing the pact. It was about dismantling it, unraveling the threads that had kept it in place for so long. He knew that there had to be a key to undoing the pact, a way to sever the town's connection to whatever dark force had claimed its children. The council had spoken of it in whispers, of the town's history and its unspoken connection to something older, something that had always demanded payment. But the records were cryptic, full of half-formed explanations, as if those who had written were too afraid to put the full truth on paper. The father dug deeper, sifting through the decaying documents, reading between the lines, piecing together the fragmented histories, the faded legends. He discovered references to ancient rites, to a dark figure whose identity was hidden in the murk of time. There were allusions to rituals performed in the dead of night, rituals meant to appease something that existed beyond the town's understanding, something that fed on the lives of its children. But there was something more, something that made the father's heart race with a new kind of hope. Hidden among the records was a mention of an object, a relic, that could disrupt the ritual. It was described as an artifact of power, something that had been passed down through generations but had been lost to history. The records were vague, fragmented by time and neglect, but there were enough clues to suggest that it was a key that could sever the pact, destroy the force that had claimed the town's children for so long. The father's pulse quickened as he read the lines over and over, the possibility of breaking the cycle finally within his grasp. But there was no time to waste. The longer he delayed, the more the town's hold on the pact would strengthen, and the more it would tighten its grip on the very soul of the place. With no clear direction but the fragments of knowledge he had pieced together, the father set out on his quest to find the artifact. He ventured into forgotten parts of the town, the places that time had forgotten, the places where the town's history had been buried. He visited old churches, abandoned buildings, secret places hidden deep in the woods, searching for any sign, any clue that might lead him to the artifact. Each step felt like a descent into madness, a journey through the remnants of a town that had lost its way. But he could not stop. His son's life was at stake. The father had never felt more determined, more resolute. He knew the risk. He knew that finding the artifact might not be enough to break the cycle, but it was the only hope he had left. Days turned into weeks, and the father's search became an obsession. He scoured the town's forgotten corners, following leads that seemed to lead nowhere, only to uncover fragments of forgotten histories, stories that had been lost to time. But then, finally, after weeks of searching, he found something, a hidden chamber beneath the old church, long sealed off from the rest of the world. The door was old and weathered, but when he pried it open, a rush of cold air filled the space, and the father stepped into the darkened room. It was as if the chamber had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. Inside, on a pedestal, sat an object unlike anything he'd ever seen, a relic from a time long past, covered in dust and cobwebs, its surface engraved with strange symbols.